good morning. My name is Song Qin. I'm now president of International Marine Biotechnology Association. On behalf of Professor Dr. Russell here, he is previous president of IMBA, but now he is an urgent task. Welcome you and all the scientists, young students. Good evening, good morning. Welcome all of you to this IMBA online symposium named Blue Carbon Biotechnology. As you know, since the foundation of IMBA in 1989, last century, IMBA has been dedicated to advancing marine biotechnology for benefiting humanity as well as natural ecosystems. Today's online symposium reflects this commitment as we bring together some of the world's leading scientists to share their cutting-edge research and insights into blue carbon biotechnology. This new field holds tremendous potential, not only in understanding carbon sequestration in marine ecosystem, but also in developing solutions to tackle climate change. This symposium is organized by IMBA, International Marine Biotechnology Association. And also, we would like to extend our special thanks to ocean negative carbon emissions. Once, the big project, international project, and also the International Coastal Bio Congress, ICBC, the second International Coastal Biology Congress, the second ICBC, for their invaluable support in making this event happening. I hope our corporation would like to enrich our efforts to integrate marine biotechnology solutions into global efforts against climate change, particularly in the field of coastal zone research, biotechnology, blue carbon, and ocean negative carbon emissions. Today, we are very honored to invite Professor Peng Zhao, Professor Isaac Santos, Professor Dan Fries as our keynote speakers. Also, we are very happy to see young scientists and students. They are Dr. Shailesh Nair and Ms. Lu Yao Wang as our junior scientists to make flash talks. Our symposium today will focus on key topics such as carbon measurement, blue carbon resource management, and the enhancement of carbon sinks. I am confident that this discussion and presentations from our distinguished speakers and young scientists will spark new ideas and collaborations, further advancing progress in this critical new area. Once again, on behalf of my co-chair, Professor Dr. Russell here, and International Marine Biotechnology Association board members, I extend my heartfelt thanks to all of you for being here today. I look forward to the exciting presentations and fruitful discussions ahead. Our symposium today will be divided into two parts. The first part is keynote presentations. Second part is flash talks. I now would like to hand over the floor to my colleagues, Dr. Wang Yu, to give a detailed introduction of our next speakers and lectures. Dr. Wang, please.
Thank you, Professor Qin, for the opening remarks. Good evening, everyone. I'm Yu Wang from Yantai Institute of Coastal Zone Research, Chinese Academy of Sciences, and I will be your host for today's symposium. Our first speaker is Professor Zhao Peng, Associate Professor at Hainan University. Professor Zhao is known for his extensive work in blue carbon science and policy, coastal wetland conservation, and remote sensing. Let's give a warm welcome to Professor Zhao.
Okay. Could you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, very
Okay,
clear.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Qin and Professor Liu Zhengyi, who invited me. And it's my great honor to present this topic in such kind of symposium. First, I'm a graduate from LCAS, and actually, I'm also a member of the September 3rd Society. So, yeah, many association with the Professor Qin. And now, okay, I'd like to give some brief discussions about the blue carbon from the UNFCCC's perspective, scope, accounting, and mitigation. Actually, besides mitigation, we also see many great potentials of the climate adaptation, adaptation potentials, especially from the view of the from the case of the typhoon in Hainan province. I come from the Hainan University. Yeah, first, the climate change is the most important, the most challenges we faced, the human faced today, and developing countries, including China, are the most vulnerable countries to the climate change. And if we don't take actions to reverse this trend, the Earth will become another Mars. So we all know that, there are many negative impacts of the climate change, and as we all know, and actually there's no much time left for us. In last 30 years, the United Nations issued the parties of United Nations make agreement on the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. And for the Paris Agreement, we set a goal to confine the temperature rise within 2 degrees and strive for the 1.5 degree. But now we all talk about the 1.5 degree target. That is because in 2018, the IPCC released a global warming of 1.5 degree assessment report, which figure out if we don't achieve the goal of 1.5 degree at the end of this century, that is to say, we need to peak the carbon dioxide emissions in 2040s. The ecosystem of the Earth will face irreversible change, which means we have no solutions at that time. So most for the marine ecosystem, they are the most vulnerable ecosystem in the world. If the temperature rise is above 1.5 degree. And before we talk about blue carbon, we need to look back. We need to understand some basic definitions about the climate change. First, what is the carbon neutrality? When we talk about this issue, we should look to the we should watch the UNFCCC. What is sink and what is source? Actually, in Chinese, we misuse sink and other words. And what is sink? The UNFCCC point out that the sink is the process and activity or mechanism of reduce the carbon dioxide or something like the carbon particles, something like this. And the source is process and activity to release the carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. And if the sink surpasses the source, we call it removal. And if sink surpass the, if the source surpass the sink, we call it emissions. If the sink, when the sink equals to source, we call it the carbon neutrality. Actually, we in Chinese word we always call it the marine sinks, the ocean sinks, or the blue carbon sinks. That is the wrong expressions. The sink is dynamic, but what we refer to is actually we call it the storage. So there are the process of the sink and source all the times between the atmosphere, the land, and oceans. So what we care about is the result between the sink and the source. Now we see the situation that the source surpasses the sink, and if we want to reach the target of the source, the carbon neutrality, we need to first to reduce carbon emissions. That is most important things. Unless we talk about the carbon, talk about the call it the blue carbon or green carbon. But the most important thing is the emission reduction. But we have to give some emissions because the society had to move forward. So we look from the aspect of the sink. We need to enhance the carbon sequestrations. For example, the CCUS, and for the ocean, the blue carbon. But there's still, we also see the natural process, including the carbon dioxide go into the ocean. With that, we call it the marine, how to say, 海洋酸化，比较长，再回拼啊。Okay, so we should notice that the meet carbon neutrality, we only consider the human caused emission reduction or carbon removal, but not take the natural process into consideration. And for many people, many scientists, even scientists, they talk about the natural process. That is still, we still seeing the sink and the source. But when we talk about climate change, we should focus on the human caused ones. So the carbon neutrality is not only the neutralization of the carbon dioxide, but include other greenhouse gases. So the carbon dioxide and the non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases reductions are equally important, and we should add a E behind the carbon dioxide. Yeah. Because the time limitations, we'll need to focus on some of these. And okay. So when we know and we see that there are many negative impact of climate change on the oceans, and all we can read this impact from the assessment report released by IPCC for each 5 years, and for the how the ocean interact with the climate change, we talk about the 5 pumps. the solubility pumps, the biological pumps, the carbonate pumps, and the microbial pumps. So these pumps, actually, that is the sink, what it means the precise, the mechanism, and yeah. So the blue carbon is really two good words that connect the ocean and climate change together. Actually, it refers to the ocean organisms, how the ocean organisms mitigate and adapt to the climate change. There are two famous reports. Actually, the first one is much more famous, the blue carbon report. It gives definitions, but it's not so precisely. And the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. This report released by IPCC. It gave official definitions for the blue carbon. The blue carbon is a biological driven carbon flux and storage in marine systems that are amenable to management. So we need to focus on several words. First is biological driven. What means biological driven? We should not take the solubility pump into consideration. And amenable to management. What's the meaning of amenable to management? Let's recall what I just showed you. The first, this is human cost. We only considered for the climate change mitigation or mitigation, especially under the UNFCCC. We only take the human-induced or human cost activities into consideration, and only people and human can make a management. So that means all the carbon flux and storage should be human-induced. So what is the amenable ecosystem? The IPCC's ROCC report refers to the mangroves, seagrasses, tidal marshes, and the macroalgae. This report refers to the macroalgae agricultures as amenable blue carbon. So in China, we talk about the fishery carbon. Besides the seashells, actually the macroalgae has been written into the IPCC report and recognize a kind of blue carbon, especially for the agricultural one. This one I would like to mention that you will find mangroves and seagrasses, and beyond the seagrass you see the white tide, that is coral reefs. So they are successive ecosystems, and when we talk about blue carbon, we should put the biodiversity first, and that is most important things. The tidal marshes, seagrasses, and the kelp forest. Actually, although we talk about the marine carbon sequestration or sink mechanisms, the full pumps, but for the IPCC report for the accounting of the greenhouse gases inventory, or even for the blue carbon trade, we still use the methodology from the land. One is from the forest and the other is from the peatland. The blue carbon and the green carbon share the same mechanism, the photosynthesis, to form the above ground biomass and below ground biomass. But what is the characters, what is special for the blue carbon? The blue carbon, the coastal vegetation, slowing water flow and promote the sedimentation to form the soil organic carbon, and the water above this sediment created a NOx environment underwater, which can preserve the carbon stocks in a very long term. And yeah, we should for the blue carbon, we should remember that for the carbon pool, the IPCC divide the carbon pool into five categories, five pools. The first two are biomass, the above ground biomass and underground or below ground biomass, and the soil. Actually, for the forest, the land, the terrestrial system don't take the soil into consideration, but the blue carbon takes soil into consideration and the dead organic, including the litter and dead wood. Yeah, these two figures show the high efficiency of carbon sequestration of blue carbon, but I think that we should focus more on not on this, because these two figures are mentioned at a very early stage of the blue carbon discussions, but now I think we should dive into much more specific topic. Yeah, so I think that I want to use this slides to discriminate or to show the difference between the Chinese word. We call it the ocean carbon sink, blue carbon sink, or blue carbon. I think for the sink, from the definition of UNFCCC, the oceanic carbon sink means the solubility pump, carbonate pumps, and BCP and MCP. But for blue carbon, it's a biological driven. But what is amenable to management? It refers to coastal blue carbon, including mangrove seagrasses, tidal marshes, and macroalgae. Well, in all of the world, especially in China and Europe, we see significant loss of the blue carbon ecosystem due to the overfishing, coastal construction, water pollution, agriculture, and habitat reduction destroy. So, in a changing world, the blue carbon ecosystem receives pressures from climate change and human activity. For China, the human activity is much more important. And we should take actions to reach the climate mitigation and adaptation goals in the aspect of blue carbon. For me, because I work on blue carbon since 2016 in the headquarters of SOA, and incorporating blue carbon into national greenhouse gases inventory is a key step in integrating blue carbon into national climate mitigation efforts. Yeah, there are several milestones. Sorry， 我的时间是不够了吗？我看看。OK， 我要加快一点。So I think we talk about the blue carbon under the UNFCCC. So we should, for first thing, for China and for other countries, to bring the blue carbons into the greenhouse gases inventory. And now we are working a lot of things on this, and we hope to move the goal forward. Actually, blue carbon also matters to the Ocean Decades goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, we find that blue carbon matters all 10 Ocean Decade challenges. It's a main solutions to some of them, and the contribute to some of the challenges, and also key areas to expand the knowledges and fix the gaps. Yeah, that is the actually the CV, the microalgae, is very important for China. Especially for China to incorporate the agricultured cultured CVs into the blue carbons. And I also like to mention the nature-based solutions at the end. Yeah, we should take the nature-based solutions into consideration, and we should notice the importance. The reasons why we talk about blue carbons in the perspective of the climate change mitigations, that is because the United Nations and the the United Nations have bring the nature-based solutions into the climate mitigation of climate actions. And what is the nature-based solutions for the oceans to solve the climate change issues? That is blue carbon. But we should actually figure out all the nature-based solutions are the local solutions. Yeah, there are some. Actually, I'm the expert, a specialist of the NBS working group for the climate actions of the United Nations. I'd like to show some good practice in this report. One is from the ALCAS, Professor Zhou Yi, and one is the carbon neutrality of BRICS meetings, and one is the restoration mangroves in abundant rain ponds and the sustainable use. So I think I don't have enough time, so I'd like to jump to the last page. Okay. Thank you for this opportunity, and I would like to make a advertisement for the Hainan University, and welcome you to come to Hainan, and to Hainan University. We also recruit faculties, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zhao. We now have 5 minutes for Q&A. Please feel free to ask the questions in the chat or click the button to raise your hand virtually to speak directly to Professor Zhao.
大家有什么问题，不要能和我们赵老师交流一下吗？赵老师可以用中文交流。
好的，好的，嗯。
赵老师，您的讲这些有没有示范基地啊？
我们其实，之前红树林是有的，然后海草床也准备再做一个，然后
规模做到多少了？
我们规模不是很大，因为那个正好赶上疫情，然后呢，就是再赶上也当时换工作，然后现在还有2个吧，几十亩吧。
红树林在哪里啊？
红树林最开始做的是在北海，广西的北海，然后现在是在海南的儋州。
We speak English. Do you have any demonstration?
Sorry?
Do you have blue carbon?
Oh, sequestration.
Demonstration. Demo.
Oh, okay.
Demo
Yeah,
size.
actually, for the blue carbon practice, I like to highlight the nature-based solutions. We have several pilot studies on the how to mainstream the blue carbons and how to combine the values or the benefits of the blue carbons and of the mangroves and the fishermen's livelihood. We cultivate, we replant mangroves in abundant stream ponds, but we should also consider the fishermen's livelihood. So we release the local marine organisms and into the pond, into the forest, mangroves, and actually we see the mangrove, the restored mangroves can generate a great benefit. Not only the marine organisms, but also the but also the also included the ecotourism. That is for mangroves and for seagrass. We also do some research in Guangxi Beihai, but now we shift to Hainan. Actually, I think for the seagrass restorations, especially in the tropical areas in China, not so similar to the North China. The first step is to increase the seedlings, the seed. So we suggest the local government. Actually, we draft some plan, some project initiative to combine the works in the laboratory, in the pond, and in the field together. We cultivate the seeds in the laboratory, and we increase the seedlings in the pond, and we move the seedlings back to the field. That is, we will build a base in Hainan Lingshui in this or next year.
Yes, thank you. As we know, mangrove has been sold. That is successful business.
Yeah, actually, to tell the truth, we are developing a mangrove restoration, a mangrove blue carbon trading project, and we will sell it to the Volkswagen. It's an international transactions. Yeah, I would like to highlight the importance to use the authentic, use the formal methodologies. Now we have the CCER, and before we use the VCS. I suggest all the we call it the proponent, or the consultant should use the real methodology, but not to make the methodology yourselves or themselves. Yeah, I think we should.
Yeah, that's a very good story.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. But the problem is the mangrove grow very slow. You can only sell once.
Yeah.
When you sell the second time, it's maybe 10 years later.
Yeah, actually, we all know that if the creatures, the organisms are matured, they stopped to stock more carbons or biomass. Actually, what we should actually for the blue carbon transaction, blue carbon trading, we should not take the blue carbon as the green carbon, as the terrestrial ecosystem. They are very vast. But for blue carbon, they are old, we call it the tropical coastal ecosystem. So the company want to make a profit. What we should do is now to just share the carbon credit of the blue carbon. We should combine, we should account all the ecosystem, we call it the ecosystem services, or ecosystem, the value of the ecosystem services, and sell not only the carbon credit, but all the story. And who is the customer? I think now to the general, the carbon buyer, they want to mitigate, they want to balance, or balance their carbon, carbon, I think how to say, yeah， 它的那个他们是买这个碳用来中和啊 ，they want to make their company the carbon neutrality.
Yes.
But I think no, that is not the
They will
story
buy
for the
the
blue carbon.
credit. Yeah, there's some plant, some power plant, they would like to buy this credit.
No, I think that is not the story. The blue carbon is so limited. They generate good story. So I think we should share the stories to the big company, the famous company, the international company who need to realize their social responsibility. We call this the 企业社会责任叫我突然忘掉了。OK，
什么？你说一遍。
企业社会责任。
Responsibility of the single company.
Okay. Yes. So I think they will pay much more money to this, but if we just sell the amount of the carbon credits, it will not generate too much benefit for the owner. So we should, for each project is very unique. We should share the project one by one. It's good story.
Okay, so Funke, we can summarize the first problem. Now we just say we say it's blue carbon. Actually, this is SOC. This is soil organic carbon. This is green carbon. Yeah, actually it's green carbon, and it's renew very slow.
Yeah.
We can sell it to power plant, a single company. But if we want a second time, it will be long time later after. So what blue carbon we want to sell ecosystem carbon, right? So this is long way to go. And also, as you say, who is the owner? Who is the owner of this ecosystem? When you get money back after you sell, now we sell the so-called blue carbon. Actually, it's the soil carbon. This is green carbon. Mangrove to single company, we get money. They do the bargain business. But next time we want to sell the blue carbon of ecosystem. But so who will be the trader? Who will be a trader? When we get the ecosystem blue carbon benefit back, we will use it again for restoration, right? So this is our dream. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Qin.
Yes, Shaq has a question. 王宇，你给说一下。
Yeah, I suppose I'm asking if you can give any specific examples of a financial transaction where a company actually buys those carbon credits in China, and
Yeah, I think that you may.
Are there clear examples? Is that happening right now?
Yeah, I think that you read a lot of news about the blue carbon transaction in China. Is that right?
Yes. For example, there's mangroves in Guangdong, Guangxi province, and also the laminaria kelp, artificially cultivated laminaria kelp, Isaac, has been transacted in Fujian province.
Okay.
There are several successful examples, so we are very happy. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, actually, I think all the carbon trade, carbon transactions, blue carbon transactions should follow into the category of the agreed by IPCC.
好，王宇，再继续吧。
Thank you for the excellent discussion. If there are no further questions, let's welcome our next speaker, Professor Santos. Professor Santos has contributed immensely to our understanding of carbon fluxes in coastal ecosystems. His work, involving over 250 peer-reviewed publications, focus on quantifying carbon budgets and submarine groundwater discharge. Please welcome Professor Santos.
Thanks. Thanks for the invite. It's really nice to see some familiar faces. I was in Yantai about 6 months ago, and really enjoyed learning about the amazing facilities you have at Yantai and at the Yellow River. research station down there, and all the amazing research you guys are doing. So really nice to see you again. So I'll be talking about outwelling as a bit of the ugly duck of the blue carbon, transportation pathways. The work I'll be talking about today has been done mostly by those 4 people you see on the bottom: Gloria Reifmeyer, Yvonne Yao, Alex Cabral, and Xiaogang Chen. Xiaogang is a professor at Westlake University in China, and those 4 colleagues have published some of the major papers on the topic. So when you think about blue carbon, like we were just talking about, you often visualize those coastal ecosystems: mangroves, seagrass, salt marshes, and macroalgae. So they're highly efficient. They hide maybe 50% of the sediment carbon in the oceans. And that has led us to this vision of blue carbon, in that we have this process of, we transfer the CO2 through vegetation into the sediments. This illustration you see here is from a paper in Nature that was, creating some more fuzz about the blue carbon potential for sequestering carbon as a nature-based solution against climate change. So like we were just talking before, that carbon ideally is amenable to management. You got to be able to do something to increase that process of transfer of carbon from the atmosphere to sediments. The concept has been building from these comparisons between the coastal ecosystems, salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses, and tropical forests. So that's probably the first strong argument about the potential for blue carbon ecosystems to be so special. As you can see, the area of blue carbon ecosystems is very small compared to the big terrestrial ecosystems. However, the carbon barrier rate is much higher on a square meter basis in those 3 coastal ecosystems. If you multiply the area on top by the barrier rates in the middle, you get the total global carbon barrier. And then, those original papers told us that salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrass meadows, they may bury nearly as much carbon or comparable amounts as the big tropical, boreal, and temperate forests, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. There are lots of issues with that comparison, but the reality is that this argument has been very useful to develop the topic, to build a community, and to generate momentum in research in this field. So this argument has been all about soils or sediments, you name it. We now have these global compilations summarizing fluxes of carbon into sediments. This is an example from salt marshes and mangroves. It's a compilation led by Faming Wang in Shanghai, one of our colleagues in China. I'm not sure Faming is here today. He essentially summarized the data from 500 sediment cores all over the world, and was able to generate these refined estimates of the fluxes of carbon to mangroves and salt marsh soils, and kind of updates earlier estimates based on much less data. Faming Wang also put together predictions of how climate change is going to impact those soil carbon barrier rates. And in general, climate change is going to give us good opportunities for mangroves and salt marshes to store more carbon. They tend to be happy if that's raining, if that's hot. However, that perspective, concentrating on the soil carbon, has been missing some major carbon reservoirs in the ocean. This is a summary of the global carbon budget. We have annual updates for the global carbon budget. That's from 2023. They're going to publish the new one around November, early December. So it should be coming up anytime. Watch out for the global carbon budget 2024. So this illustration shows us many, many things. One of the key ideas I want to highlight is that the pool, the dissolved inorganic carbon pool on the bottom right is very large. So the amount of carbon we have in the oceans as DIC, or dissolved inorganic carbon, is about 10 times greater than sediments, soils and sediments. But we have been putting all this emphasis in soil and sediments. The other thing is that the DIC in the oceans stays there for a very long time. of 10 to maybe 100,000 years. So the DIC has a long residence time, which tells us that it's potentially a very good reservoir to store carbon. So if you can turn the CO2 from the atmosphere into dissolved inorganic carbon and hide in the ocean, we have a storage mechanism. And that's the question I'll be asking today. How important that can be compared to the conventional carbon burial pathway that we have been studying for a long time now. So as I said, much of our community has been taking sediment cores. That has been the journey of a generation of blue carbon scientists, starting maybe 15 years ago with those very important benchmark reports. And we now have sediment cores from many, many places with major initiatives like the American Carbon Atlas that summarize the data for the whole planet. And I often think that us as a community, with that big focus on soils and sediments, we have been digging our head in the mud. And maybe we are failing to see where there is lots of carbon, and that can be in this beautiful clean seawater. DIC, or dissolved inorganic carbon, occurs in seawater at nearly constant concentrations globally. The concentrations are very high in the oceans, and that's essentially invisible. We have a very high concentration background in the ocean, but maybe mangrove, salt marsh, and seagrass can interfere with that. So I have been building this hypothesis for many years now, and that all began with this pie chart you can see on the right. So the pie, you can visualize the pie as the amount of CO2 that's transferred from the atmosphere to one tree, to one mangrove tree. So that mangrove tree will die eventually, and then you try to find where is all of that carbon going to. About 15 years ago, when that pie was first put together, we couldn't explain about 50% of the carbon fixed by mangrove vegetation. We knew that that slice is burial. We knew that CO2 returns to the atmosphere, which gives us a net zero benefit. CO2 goes into the vegetation. We have respiration, mostly by microbes in the soils, and that CO2 goes back to the atmosphere. So net zero with that CO2 efflux. Some of that carbon from the vegetation decomposes, breaks down into particles, or POC, particulate organic carbon, and DOC, dissolved organic carbon. But 15 years ago, that pie was incomplete. So the hypothesis we have been testing is that alkalinity and DIC, there is a big overlap in the definition of alkalinity and DIC. That would be explaining that missing carbon sink. So I'm going to show you some data building that hypothesis from the local to the global scale. The concept of outwelling is essentially the exports of carbon, usually because of tidal flushing. Most of our coastal ecosystems, they are in contact with the nearby ocean, and tides tend to flush the carbon from those ecosystems a couple times a day. During that tidal flushing process, you have the transport of carbon from coastal vegetation to the continental shelf and eventually to the ocean. Some of that carbon is going to go as inorganic carbon, DIC, and DIC breaks down into both CO2, greenhouse gases, which give us a net zero benefit. The CO2 goes into the vegetation and goes back to the atmosphere. But some of that DIC actually penetrates the ocean as bicarbonates or alkalinity. That alkalinity is what can stay in the ocean for a very long time. Some of the carbon is going to go towards the ocean as organic carbon, either dissolved or particulates. That carbon can also stay in the ocean, or it can return to the atmosphere following oxidation into CO2. So now we're adding lots of complexity to the problem of blue carbon, of carbon sequestration, because you're going beyond the habitats. We're not only quantifying the local organic carbon burial, we're trying to understand how those ecosystems impact the carbon budget of the ocean, and therefore potentially sequester carbon in the ocean, not locally in the sediments. Now, the mechanism by which it happens relates to this tidal flushing. You need to have a physical transport process of the carbon that was fixed by the local vegetation. Now, once that carbon is in the sediment, you have multiple oxidation pathways. For the organic carbon in the sediments that goes through methanogenesis, we have a real bad effects. We are essentially turning CO2 from the atmosphere into organic carbon in the sediments, eventually into methane, a more powerful greenhouse gas. Some of that carbon is going to be respired using oxygen. So oxygen respiration in the sediments has a negligible impact on the net carbon budget, because essentially that's returning the CO2 that came from the atmosphere. It's going back to the atmosphere. So net zero. If aerobic respiration is the main process burning the soil carbon, it's a net zero climate effect. However, all those processes in green, they're the heroes. So those processes in green, they would be turning that soil organic carbon into alkalinity, usually bicarbonates. The equation down there is one of the key equations for the ones who like geochemistry. Sorry if that sounds complicated, but you can see the production of alkalinity right there. That's the equation explaining pyrites creation. And that pyrite burial produces 6 units of alkalinity, right? Burning sulfates. Those things are quite abundant in mangrove and salt marsh soils, and we have a net climate benefit because alkalinity is carbon storage in the oceans. So the physics of that is all about tidal pumping, and that links ecology, or maybe the availability of crabs. If you have a healthy salt marsh or mangrove full of crabs, we have these porous structures in the soils, and that porosity enables flushing of the soils and the penetration of sulfate. So that penetration of sulfate is essential for the production of alkalinity. We know that some ecosystems, we have lots of crab burrows, they're abundant, and sometimes we don't because of pollution or destruction of vegetation or many other reasons. So in the last maybe 5 years or so, we have been making measurements in specific locations. So in contrast to the soil carbon burial research that we now have literally thousands of sediment cores from those blue carbon ecosystems, we have maybe about 40 investigations of outwelling in salt marshes and mangroves. So Shogun Chen just put together this summary, the latest global update of outwelling in salt marshes. You can see the red dots, the locations where those observations have been made. And usually those data sets are quite small because it's so difficult to measure outwelling. We tend to have observations for only a few days or maybe a couple of weeks. That's what's possible with the average research budget. What you can see from Shogun Chen's budget is that carbon burial for salt marshes at 21 teragram of carbon per year is much lower than the outwelling of DIC, DOC, and POC combined. So that lateral exchange or outwelling exceeds carbon burial by 2 or 3 times in salt marshes. Now, the question is whether that carbon stays in the ocean or that goes back to the atmosphere. So DIC alone, we don't know if that's CO2 or if that's alkalinity. The CO2 goes to the atmosphere and the alkalinity stays in the ocean. So in another global summary linked to Shogun Chen's summary, our colleague Gloria Reifmeyer and a very large group of researchers, including some colleagues from Yantai University, Kai Chao. Professor Kai Chao was essential, helping us to build those data sets. So Gloria Reifmeyer put together this summary with all the salt marsh and mangrove data sets and asking this question: is alkalinity rather than CO2 the major carbon transportation process? And that's a summary of the data. So the two diagrams are showing mangroves on top and salt marshes on the bottom. You have the pie that I showed you for mangroves. So the pie I showed you before had about 50% of the primary production unaccounted for. And after all these years of research, 15 years later, now we have DIC data for maybe 40 locations around the world. We are now closing the pie for mangroves. We still have about 28% of the pie unaccounted for, and that's related to uncertainties in each one of those terms of the carbon budget. We see that DIC outwelling is mostly alkalinity. The DIC is almost 100% alkalinity in mangroves, right? So therefore, DIC outwelling is a form of carbon sequestration because alkalinity doesn't go back to the atmosphere. It stays in the ocean for at least 10,000 years. If you look at the salt marsh pie on the bottom there, we still have a very large slice of the pie that's unaccounted for. About 47% of the salt marsh primary production we cannot explain with the data available. So closing that pie offers huge research opportunities that I realize many of our colleagues in China are trying to fill right now. Again, salt marshes, DIC outwelling, which is a large fraction of that is alkalinity, is higher than carbon burial. So you can see that the total alkalinity exports of 1.1, they are comparable to the burial. And when you add up the DOC and the POC, we have more outwelling, more carbon going away than staying put in the salt marsh. So to wrap up, the blue carbon science has developed a lot in the last 15 years or so. We now have very large data sets for soils and sediments. There's still lots of pending questions. But I think a major emerging question is whether alkalinity outwelling is also a blue carbon, a type of blue carbon sequestration. I think conceptually it's a yes. Can we manage alkalinity outwelling to enhance carbon sequestration in the oceans, not in the soils? I think that's still a pending question. Groundwater is the mechanism, or groundwater flushing is what triggers the process. So that carbon outwelling is quite high, and that exceeds burial in most places where that has been quantified. And to wrap up, outwelling data sets that remain extremely limited. Like I showed you from the previous maps, you have about 40 locations where somebody had a goal, where they try to quantify that at some level. We don't know what's really driving outwelling. We don't have predictions about how climate change is going to impact outwelling. We don't have any clear links to land use. Is pollution a problem for outwelling? We know that some type of nutrient fertilization is actually good for carbon burial. Mangroves, they like the nutrients, they grow quicker. If you have too much, they may suffer. But there is a sweet spot, there is a threshold where eutrophication can be beneficial for burial, and later it becomes a problem for burial. We don't have any clue about how outwelling links to eutrophication or maybe climate change. No predictions about what's going to happen in the future. So I think outwelling is an emerging question. We have at least 10 years of research ahead of us. There are many opportunities for both research and also management. I think we're still a long way from including alkalinity outwelling into the blue carbon framework, into IPCC level conversations because of the very large uncertainties and the complexity of the process. So I would say that right now, I would hope we can start building those predictors so we can have global models that can be extrapolated from the few regions where data sets are available to the whole planet, like we have for soil carbon burial right now. So thanks again for the invitation. It was a pleasure to see the earlier talk, and looking forward to learn more about blue carbon in China and from my colleagues coming up. Thank you. Happy to take questions if any pop up.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
A wonderful lecture. 华语能听见吗？
可以。Okay, thank you, Professor Santos. And again, please use the chat or raise hand function to ask some questions to Professor Santos. Is there any problems to Professor Santos, dear audience?
I cannot see the chats. If yeah,
There's no questions in the chat now.
I was very
Let's
clear.
read some. Oh, okay. Okay, you see the chat, but no questions in the in that window. Okay, let's move to our next speaker.
Thank you,
Okay, we are
Isaac,
very
for your wonderful
honored.
lecture. Thanks.
Okay, we are very honored to have Professor Fries as our keynote speaker. He is a member of the Blue Carbon Initiative and the IUCN Mangrove Specialist Group. He also serves as the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Virus Climate Change. Professor Fries has extensive expertise in blue carbon stocks and fluxes, with a focus on mangroves and seagrass in Southeast Asia and beyond. Let's give a warm welcome to Professor Fries.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I hope you can hear me and see me okay. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope you can see that.
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks very much. And I'm really interested, particularly in what we would call the traditional blue carbon ecosystem. So my talk is going to focus predominantly on mangroves because of data availability, but I'll also touch on some seagrass and tidal marsh aspects in this talk. And I think my talk is really going to link to some of the questions we've had in both talks, and particularly Dr. Xiaopeng's talk about being amenable to management. So I'm going to talk about the scales of blue carbon and how we measure it, but then maybe how that links to the scales of management. And before I get to that, I want to acknowledge that a lot of the work that you're going to see in the next few slides is from this group, our lab group, which is in Tulane University in the US and the National University of Singapore. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about 4 things in the next 20 to 25 minutes. These 3 different scales of how we measure blue carbon and how we conceptualize blue carbon, our local scale measurements, our landscape scale, and then talking about the global distributions and controls on blue carbon, particularly using mangroves as an example, because that's where most of my work occurs. But then I think we're gonna see that the scales at which blue carbon is very easy to measure and very strong is different to the scales that we might manage. And this mismatch is what I want to discuss towards the end. So yeah, we've talked a little bit about this huge interest in blue carbon, and it's really due to graphs like this. And so this is a compilation of different sequestration rates that we made a few years ago of a range of different vegetated ecosystems. And you can see that the per unit area rates of carbon sequestration in blue carbon ecosystems is multiple times higher than other terrestrial vegetated ecosystems. And this is, one of the sorts of information that got people really interested in blue carbon in the first place, because you don't need a huge area of these ecosystems to make a meaningful contribution to climate change mitigation, because they're able to sequester and accumulate carbon at these very high rates. And that translates then to very high densities of storage. And again, you will have seen many different graphs like this. There was a key graph by Daniel Donato in 2011 that really raised the profile of mangrove blue carbon by showing that the storage in the mangroves that they measured predominantly in South Asia and the Pacific were 3 to 5 times more carbon per hectare than some terrestrial systems. And this graph shows a similar thing for some of our field sites in Singapore, where even in Singapore as a city-state, a very urban environment, relatively disturbed blue carbon systems, but we were able to show that even in that disturbed state, particularly the mangroves were able to store almost twice as much carbon per hectare as the protected terrestrial forests. And what's interesting in this graph is that the biomass is kind of the same between the mangroves and the forest, or the forest might be even more biomass, but it's that storage in the soil that makes blue carbon systems so unique and so important. And so, these are very productive systems anyways, but then being tidal ecosystems, their waterlogged soils are just able to store more of that soil organic carbon in the top 1 to 3 meters of the soil column compared to terrestrial systems. So these kind of graphs are really what got this concept of blue carbon and all this interest, maybe 10 years ago or so. But of course, the blue carbon cycle is a lot more complex than just sequestration coming in and storage in the soil. And we've saw, particularly in the last presentation, the complexity of the dissolved carbon cycle. And so this is just the blue carbon cycle for mangroves and seagrasses that we estimated for a project in Indonesia. And, it just gives you an idea of all of the things you have to measure if you want to get an idea of what the blue carbon cycle actually is in your site. So we do have, a lot of inputs. So we have carbon sequestration, soil carbon accumulation, etc. We have a lot of outputs. So there's really a net carbon balance here, where we also have efflux of greenhouse gas emissions and things. And then there's a lot of transfer within and between the system as well. So the system being transformed, the carbon being transformed within and between systems. Now, luckily, to understand the climate change mitigation benefit, we may not have to calculate all of these, or to generate carbon credits, we may not have to calculate all of these, or at least we can use default measures for some of these. But there are many of them that we do need to have a good handle on. And just to show you, that's just within one site, but even within one site, we can have some real complexity in local scale controls on aspects of that carbon cycle. And here I want to give you an example of some work where we looked at greenhouse gas fluxes across gradients and transects within a site. And as you go from the landward part of the mangrove to the edge of the mangrove where it transitions into the tidal flat, we get variations in greenhouse gas emissions and stocks as well. And this links to a range of different reasons for this. Partly that, the areas there may have been an old legacy seagrass that the mangrove has taken over, and it's incorporating that carbon into its stocks. The greenhouse gas emissions show a lot of spatial variation, in parts due to the changes in inundation, which affects different microbial communities, and then also difference in mangrove species and their associated microbial communities, particularly with differences in pneumatophores, for example. So local scale is very important, but there's a lot of complexity. A lot of different transformations and a lot of spatial variation. Now, if we look at the next scale up, the landscape scale, it becomes very hard to look at some of those processes on these landscape scales. So we then tend to conveniently ignore a lot of those complexities, and we tend to focus more on parts of the carbon cycle that are much easier to measure at the landscape scale. And this is primarily carbon stocks. And this is just one example of above ground and soil carbon distribution, again, for the landscape of Singapore. And what you can see and this is using remote sensing, and it helps us to show, again, the spatial variation at the landscape scale. So this spatial variation is local, but also it accumulates at these larger scales. And so you can see here the difference in colors shows kind of a gradient of biomass distribution in this example. And if we zoom into some of this, you can see some very striking patterns. And this is really, in the Singapore example, a legacy of disturbance for harvesting, for aquaculture production, and then regrowth after those disturbances. So, human activity can be an important landscape control on the distribution of blue carbon. But there's also a whole set of natural controls on blue carbon distribution at the landscape scale as well. And this really starts to bring in concepts of geomorphology and the fact that not all of our coasts are the same, but they are influenced differently in different proportions of riverine input, wave input, and tidal input. And so all of our coastlines along the world will fit somewhere in this triangle. And this triangle, which is controlled primarily by hydrodynamics, gives rise to different geomorphic settings and different sedimentary settings. And these settings will have an influence on blue carbon. Some of these settings will encourage more blue carbon accumulation than others, for example. And so we see these landscape controls on different aspects of the carbon cycle. And again, I'm going to give you two examples from Singapore, where even within a small area, we have a lot of different geomorphic settings. And this is, first of all, just to look at the source of carbon coming into the system. And we know from stable isotope analysis that depending on where you are on the coast, your sources of carbon will be different. So in our open coast setting of Chek Jawa, we have a lot of oceanic contributions to dissolved and particulate organic carbon, a decent amount of macroalgal sources, but not a lot of terrestrial plants are contributing to that carbon. On our island settings, we have a similar distribution. But in our estuarine settings, we have a lot more contribution of terrigenous sediment and terrigenous derived carbon. So we know, depending on what landform your blue carbon ecosystem is on, it's going to get carbon from different areas. And that can often translate to differences in soil organic carbon stocks. So this is a seagrass example of unvegetated tidal flats and vegetated seagrass meadows. And our reef-associated systems have a lot more soil carbon, in part because there's not a lot of sediment input, so there's a lot of that carbon is more biogenic in origin. So we see this at the landscape scale, that geomorphic setting is really important to consider for blue carbon. Not all blue carbon systems are the same. Just because it's the same ecosystem, it really depends on where that ecosystem is on the coastline. Now let's take this to the global scale. So this is a model for mangroves where we try to take those landscape geomorphic settings and try and work out the distribution of them globally. And this the table shows kind of the breakdown by continent of which geomorphic setting dominates. But globally, we know that 40% of the world's mangroves are found on deltas. So high terrigenous sediment input. And that translates into 90% of the world's mangroves being these minerogenic systems, where more alloxanous contributions of sediment versus only 11% being biogenic or organogenic systems, where the carbon is really more derived in situ. So once we have those kind of global geomorphic models, we can start to upscale some of those landscape observations of geomorphic controls on carbon and upscale it to the global scale. And this is really where a lot of the work of Andre Revai he's been leading a lot of this, the global thinking on the role of geomorphic setting in carbon. And I want to give just one example of one of his studies here. This is an amazing paper. If you haven't seen it, again, it's just for mangroves, but it was a global compilation of published and unpublished mangrove carbon data. It involves the measurement of over 100,000 trees within this model. I contributed maybe a few, maybe 1,000 of those, but there's a lot of other authors that measured a lot of trees and took a lot of soil cores to go into this study. And taking all of that information, linking it to a number of different climatic and geomorphic variables, we get, in this case, a model of above ground biomass distribution globally for mangroves. And again, you can see a big spatial variation in where the above ground carbon for mangroves is stored, with some particular hotspots in Southeast Asia, in West Africa, and the Pacific coast of South America, where we have some of the largest mangrove trees in the world and some of the trees that are maybe the least disturbed by cyclones, for example, compared to other parts of the world. So again, we are seeing this spatial variation at global scales, and not all blue carbon ecosystems are going to be equal throughout their range. And what's interesting is that we see, again, this influence of geomorphic or environmental setting, where we have different levels of above ground biomass depending on the coastal environmental setting that you're found. So this landscape control of geomorphology scales very well to the global scale too. And we see similar patterns for below ground carbon, and particularly soil organic carbon as well. And interestingly, it tends to be the inverse of the above ground biomass. So maybe globally, the average amount of carbon is the same, but the allocation between above ground and below ground may be different depending on the environmental or geomorphic setting. But it's not just stocks that show global variation. Also, some of the inputs of carbon into the system also shows global variation. And this is an example from Zhen Zhang, who's a postdoc in my lab, but did this work while he was at Xiamen University for his PhD. And he is interested in global patterns of gross primary productivity into mangroves. So using 20 years of satellite data to look at linked to on the ground productivity measurements to look at these patterns of primary productivity as a as a proxy for sequestration in some respects. And again, we see spatial variation globally in the rates of gross primary productivity. And often we can see areas of decreased productivity as well. And there's huge spatial variations. But what was consistent was that gross primary productivity was often greater in mangroves compared to neighboring evergreen broadleaf forests. But it was also much more variable than forests. So mangroves were were able to take up more productivity, but it was a little bit more uncertain and variable over time. And this time element is also important to think about at the global scale. So it's not just spatial variation here, but there is a big temporal variability in some of these, at least faster processes as well. And in this case, subsequent work is showing that it's due to climatic oscillations and climatic variability, which is causing temporal variation in gross primary productivity alongside the spatial variation. Now, all of this translates ultimately into variability in the stocks of blue carbon. And this is for all three blue carbon ecosystems, mangroves, marshes, and seagrasses. And we see, again, different countries, depending on their climate, the amount of coastline they have, and other variables, show distinct differences in the amount of global blue carbon stocks that they have. And we have a bit of uncertainty in some of this, but at least for these three ecosystems, we think it's probably in excess of 30,000 teragrams of blue carbon stored globally. Though there's uncertainty in that predominantly because of uncertainty in areas of seagrass meadows globally. But we talked about how this doesn't really matter if these systems are not amenable to management. If we're going to use them for climate change mitigation, we need to be able to manage them in a way that has a positive benefit on carbon dynamics. And we can do that in three different ways: by conservation, by restoration, and by other management of blue carbon systems. And we've been able to calculate kind of the global contribution of blue carbon if we were able to do these three things. And these graphs kind of show the countries that have the most climate mitigation potential with blue carbon, and it's areas like Indonesia. And that's in part because there's lots of loss and lots of potential for restoration of mangroves and seagrasses in Indonesia. So these graphs show the breakdown of how much we could avoid if we stopped deforestation, or how much, if we could do the maximum restoration, how much we could restore in terms of carbon. And mangroves have probably the greatest mitigation potential, but also the other systems do too. And we think we could, if we combined, zero deforestation with the maximum possible restoration, we could probably get over 1,000 teragrams of carbon per year in climate mitigation benefit. And if we compare that to global fossil fuel emissions, it's about 3% of global fossil fuel emissions. Now, that doesn't sound a lot, right? And we've talked a lot about how great blue carbon is, but globally, we expect blue carbon to only offset 3% of fossil fuel emissions. And this is with maximum restoration, maximum conservation, which honestly are probably not realistic. So this is a bit of the blue carbon reality check, that at the global scale, blue carbon is going to be, it is one important tool in the toolbox of options we have for climate change mitigation, but it is not the silver bullet, and it's not going to get us beyond the very hard tasks of decarbonizing our economies and doing all of the hard work first, and then using blue carbon for a small amount of those residual emissions. And there's a reason why it's maybe so low at the global scale. I showed you this graph earlier about the per unit area sequestration rates, and blue carbon ecosystems are great at that scale. But their extent globally is tiny compared to other ecosystems because they are limited to this narrow coastal fringe. So on a global sequestration basis, blue carbon is pretty small, at least for vegetated sequestration, compared to other ecosystems, primarily because of their small extent. So we shouldn't ask blue carbon systems to solve all of the climate change problems, and we can't expect them to because their extent is so small. So what scale should we be managing blue carbon at? If we, this global contribution is going to be relatively limited. Well, luckily, we don't manage climate change at the global scale. We manage it at the national scale, where all countries have to do their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. And a lot of countries have potential to do this for blue carbon because there's over 150 countries with a blue carbon ecosystem. And if we just do that comparison again of fossil fuel emissions versus carbon sequestration, in this analysis, we showed that there are 17 countries out of those 151 that could actually offset more than 5% of their fossil fuel emissions with blue carbon. So, okay, not every country, and at a global scale, maybe not feasible, but at the national scale, there are going to be some countries, predominantly with large blue carbon resources, with lots of loss and relatively low fossil fuel emissions, where blue carbon is actually a viable climate change mitigation strategy. And we particularly see this for small island states, where they may not have many other vegetated resources, but they may have extensive blue carbon resources. And so these are 37 different small island states. And, excuse me, and the numbers are not important, but really what the colors mean here is countries where mangroves can offset more than 10% of their land use emissions. So this is not fossil fuel emissions now, but it's land use emissions. And these countries in dark blue, are able to, their current mangroves are able to sequester at least 10% of their land use emissions. Avoided deforestation scenario, a number of countries, if they were able to stop mangrove loss, would be able to offset more than 10% of their land use emissions, and then the combination of those. So again, not every country is going to be able to do this, but some countries will be able to. And we see many of these countries exactly doing this. So if you look in the most recent nationally determined contributions, a number of countries do have explicit blue carbon targets to get to net zero. So this is really encouraging. But then I'll just wrap up with the final scale, getting back to the local. We talked a bit earlier about carbon credit projects, and we do see globally a lot of potential for those site scale projects. So again, globally, maybe we can't do much, but at the site scale, we can generate a lot of conservation and restoration finance through carbon credits, particularly in areas in Southeast Asia. And so this model shows that maybe 20% of the world's mangroves could qualify for local scale carbon financing. So definitely at the national scale and the local scale, we have a lot of potential to do some good work with blue carbon. So in summary, scale is really important to understand at what scale they can be most efficient as a natural climate solution for climate change mitigation. We know that at those different scales, there are different controls on blue carbon. But really, we're going to realize those opportunities for management at local scales and national scales in some context. So that's just a summary of those slides. And just to end while I have you here, I'm an editor-in-chief for the journal Wire's Climate Change. We do a lot of work on climate change. I would love to see blue carbon more represented in the journal. And particularly, I'd like to just show this slide now because we don't have a lot of submissions from China. And I would really like to encourage you, if you're interested, to submit to this journal so that we can get a better geographic distribution of knowledge of climate change. So just wanted to do that quick shout out. If you're interested, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good journal. Wires. F factor above 9. Thank you. Santos, thank you. Thank you very much. Have a very good journal.
Thank you. And I'd welcome any questions in the chat if there are.
有中文的问题提问也行，我们会翻译给Dan Fries 教授。有没有问题？
Professor Fries, and there is a question submitted in our online chat room. The question is that I submitted into the chat room. The question is, what's the current opinion about the role of microalgae in carbon sequestration, both on land and in ocean? And do you think microalgae might have a big role in capturing in marine carbon capturing?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Whether it's microalgae or macroalgae, there's a lot of potential, but there's one challenge, and a challenge for using it for climate change mitigation. Not to say that they are not, they definitely have an important role in carbon cycling and in carbon sequestration in general, but it's this amenable to management part, right? And this is where the challenge is, because it's very easy to show the climate change mitigation potential of mangroves, seagrass, and marshes, because the pathway for sequestration, but then the pathway for burial and for permanence is clear to see, because of the relatively clear flow into the soil component. With micro and macroalgae, it's a little more challenging to prove that, though the science is getting better at that. But the science is also showing that permanence of storage is not, it also shows big global variation. So in some locations, it may be easier to show the burial and permanence than in other locations. If you can prove the burial and permanence over time scales that are important for climate change, so at least 100 years, then yes, they will play a really important role in climate change mitigation.
王宇，你能翻译一下吧？Can you translate to Chinese？
Fritz 教授的意思就是说，微藻它其实答案其实是肯定的，就是微藻会在它会做过程中发挥很重要的作用。然后微藻的话，它其实是因为Fritz 教授的意思就是说，它从不同的尺度上来判断，就像他在报告里说的那样，就是在陆地这个范围的话，微藻的研究会比较多一点，而且在陆地的生态系统里面，比如说树林，然后或者说红树林这些生态系统里面，微藻都可以发挥很重要的作用。
我补充一下，刘玉环老师，微藻啊，因为 Fries 教授说微藻在全球碳循环当中的作用是毋庸置疑的，因为能把光合作用，能把二氧化碳转成有机碳。刘玉环老师在吧？但是至于能不能埋藏，甚至埋藏100年以上，从全球的各个不同的地理位置和不同的尺度，那就差别大了。这微藻的光合作用固碳是碳汇，但是不是碳埋藏，这是个问题。如果说碳移除了以后，那么微藻如果是在海洋当中降解了，那碳又基本回去了，有一部分当然变成一个 RDOC， 就是惰性有机碳，这一块焦念志愿士正在研究，这是一块。如果是到了变成人类的食物，也会成为二氧化碳。如果变成食物移除的这一块碳也是0。刘玉环老师，你在吧？你能回应一下吗？刘玉环老师，所以海洋微藻的碳汇作用，我们可以专题再做一些研究。Thank you very much, Fries. Thank you. The wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
好，继续吧，那个王宇。
Okay. With that, we conclude the keynote presentations for today. I'd like to thank all of your keynote speakers once again for their talks and for sharing their cutting-edge research with us. Next, we move on to the next segment of our symposium. In this segment, we will have two flash talks by our outstanding junior scientists in blue carbon biotechnology. Our first speaker is Dr. Shailesh Nair. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nair. Please.
Thank you. Firstly, let me share my screen. This one. So, can you see my PowerPoint slide?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, firstly, thank you, IMBA, for inviting me. It's a great honor to be present here and sharing my work. So I am Shailesh Nair. I am a researcher at Professor Yongyu Zhang's Marine Carbon Sequestration and Energy Microorganism Group. So I'll be talking about how the changing oceans affect the seaweed microbiome interactions and how it will have any implication for the ocean carbon sequestration. So why seaweed? I won't be talking much about the blue carbon because the previous talks have told excellent detail and description of the blue carbon. So seaweed is globally distributed species of microalgae. They come in red, brown, and green colors. And they have enormous carbon potential, which is estimated to be at least around 144.9 teragram of carbon sequestration every year. That is like a huge army of carbon captors in the sea, keeping our climate in check. So they are the major contributors to coastal primary productivity. They also nurtures huge biodiversity, including the commercial fishes. And most importantly, the seaweeds, they can be used for human consumption, for animal feed, fertilizers, and various other commercial products such as biofuels. So hence, the seaweed industry has been gaining wide attention globally. In the past 30 years, the seaweed industry has tripled in size, mostly dominated by Asia and especially China. So this is one of the seaweed mariculture site in China. A recent study, they estimate that if we expand seaweed farming over 1% of the ocean area, it could avoid more than 20 gigatons of carbon equivalent emission and can directly sequester more than 9 gigatons of carbon annually. But there is a problem with this. Because our oceans are changing, the seaweeds are in decline. Globally, there is like 40 to 60% of seaweed forest has been lost in past 50 years with an annual decline rate of 1.8%. Just look at this concerning image along the coast of Northern California. Here, within a period of 6 years, the total kelp forest has been lost. So the major drivers for this is climate change and anthropogenic pressure. So in 2022, unknown disease wiped out 95% of the cultured seaweed seaweed harvest in Weihai, China. So Weihai, China is in China is one of the high density kelp farming area, largest high density kelp farming area. And this was one of the worst disease event in past 60 years. So we investigated this, why it happened. We found that the sea light transparency or the seawater transparency was 3 times higher than previous 2 years. So this high sudden abnormal seawater transparency, along with there was some low nutrient condition, this together put pressure on the seaweed and its interaction with its microbiome or the microorganism. So there was a disbalance among this microorganism which led to proliferation of certain pathogenic bacteria. And this pathogenic bacteria spread this disease. So why this happened? Usually it doesn't happen there. Another study, they found out that when this disease event occurred just some time ago, there was a extreme rainfall event in China. So this rainfall event through a cascading events caused this high sea water light transparency. So why this seaweed and its microbiome is important, the interaction is important. One thing we have to understand that like the agricultural land, we cannot put fertilizers or chemicals in the ocean. So the natural environmental condition, as well as the interaction between seaweed and its microbiome, is very important for the healthy growth of the seaweed. Seaweed consists of diverse microorganisms, including prokaryotes like bacteria, archaea, microeukaryotes like fungi, protists, and microalgae, and viruses. So this diverse group of microorganisms together, they form the microbiome of seaweed, and they provide essential nutrients to the seaweed. Also provide secondary metabolites which can promote this cellular development. There are various studies that have successfully shown that presence of certain type of bacteria can promote this cellular development in seaweed. They also protect the seaweed from pathogenic attack as well as the environmental stresses. For example, a study published in IMBA journal, they showed that presence of some beneficial bacteria protected the red seaweed from bleaching disease. So that's why this microbiome and seaweed interaction is very important. But these natural microbiome, they are not efficiently adapted to for these sudden changes in the oceanic waters. We investigated the global microbiome data and found that in future oceanic conditions such as acidification and warming, such microbiome disbalance induced seaweed disease might be higher. Along with this, warming also accelerates the microbial decomposition of seaweed. So together, this will seriously undermine the seaweed carbon sequestration potential. But there are efforts going on to manipulate or engineer the seaweed microbiome. So manipulating or engineering the seaweed microbiome can enhance seaweed health, resilience, and biomass yield. But this field of seaweed microbiome manipulation is still in very early developmental stage. For successful microbiome manipulation, we need to understand, we need to have an in-depth understanding of the seaweed and its associated microorganism functioning. So the bacteria, they forms the major portion of the cellular microbiota in the seaweed microbiome. They are highly diverse, as you can see here, and varies with host type, like what kind of seaweed species, as well as what is the lifestyle of seaweed and where seaweed is growing. So depending on this, the bacterial community will vary. But empirical studies, they show that there exists a core genera. Core genera or core taxa are the taxa which are consistently present along the developmental stage of a seaweed. These are these genera included in this core taxa. So core taxa are likely evolved for forming symbiotic interaction with the seaweed. So this core taxa, we can exploit it to manipulate their interaction with the seaweed. But unfortunately, apart from the bacteria, we do not know much about the other taxa which are present in the seaweed microbiome. And this forms the dark matter of the seaweed microbiome. Recently, in my lab, me and another colleague, we published a paper, and we found that the seaweed, especially the farm seaweed, they harbor diverse novel bacteriophages that may regulate the seaweed-associated bacterial ecology, as well as seaweed-bacteria interactions. Similarly, there are reports of diverse archaea and microeukaryotes present in the seaweed, but their function remains cryptic. So without fully understanding these unexplored taxa, we cannot understand the seaweed. Coming to the current progresses in the seaweed microbiota manipulation, there are various studies that have shown successful seaweed microbiota manipulation in laboratory. This table and this graph is showing these studies. I won't be going into detail about each of these studies, but these are early studies conducted in the lab, and their success from lab to field translation remains to be tested. As I said, the seaweed microbiota manipulation is in its early stage. There lacks a robust or holistic approach for these manipulation practices. So recently we wrote a paper which is currently is in review. We put this holistic approach, which can form a roadmap for the future studies. In this, we propose that 3 parts we have proposed. The first is in situ microbiome characterization. So we can use the omics technology to characterize the total microbiome of the seaweed along the seaweed growth stage, as well as during the environmental variation. And through this, we can find the core bacterial or core microbial taxa. Once we find the core microbial taxa, we can use genome scale metabolic modeling. These are computational models that can predict the total metabolic function of the bacteria, of the microbes. So then we can understand what kind of function they are performing. And also we can predict the complementary strains. So complementary members are the members which share the same function. So even when we are testing this approach, if one bacteria or one microbe fail, we can replace it with a complementary strain. So once this is done, the next step is we need to do a ecological network modeling to understand the microbe-microbe interaction. Because if the microbe-microbe interaction is highly negative, then they will cross each other. So from this, we can establish what kind of bacteria we need to include. Then comes the high throughput isolation. For high throughput isolation, we can use fluidic systems which can grow thousands of bacterial cells in a short time using different growth conditions. And what kind of growth conditions we have to use depends. We can use machine learning method. There are recent papers about machine learning method which can predict the growth condition of the microorganisms. Through this, we can isolate the desired microbes we want. Then we can establish multiple iterations of this microbiota into different pairs, and can be tested with the seaweed using different environmental stress. And once we identify the successful iteration or successful synthetic community, that can be directly tested in the field. Another consideration we can include in this is the incorporation of bacteriophages. As I said, bacteriophages, they can regulate the bacterial ecology. We can use this function of bacteriophage to stabilize the bacterial community structure in microbiome. However, all this is theoretical, and there is a lot of experimental work need to be done. So from this, to conclude, seaweed farming offers significant potential for carbon sequestration and reducing agriculture pressure. However, climate change threatens its sustainability. Seaweed microbiome manipulation is a powerful tool to sustainably expand large-scale seaweed farming. But to ensure its success, there is an urgent need to completely understand seaweed microbiome dynamics and their effects on the seaweed health under changing oceanic conditions. with this, I end my presentation. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, you can ask me now, or you can contact me at these two addresses, or you can contact my lab at this address. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nair. And let's welcome our next speaker, Ms. Lu Yao Wang, postgraduate student at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Let's welcome Ms. Lu Yao Wang. Please.
好，非常感谢。大家有什么问题？
OK
没有问题。现在最后一个，因为时间已经到10点钟了。
Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Wang Liao from Yantai Institute of Coastal Zone Research. It's my pleasure to be here to share our work. The screen displays my topic for today. Our research subject is intertidal microalgae. They inhabit zones subject them to desiccation and immersion circles. Our research aims to unravel how this circle affects the carbon sequestration capabilities of this microalgae. The previous expert have already introduced the blue carbon, and I have benefited greatly from them. So here I will briefly introduce the blue carbon. In simple terms, blue carbon refers to carbon that is captured by the ocean and coastal ecosystems. China, with its extensive maritime and a long coastline, has considerable potential for blue carbon development. For a long time, microalgae were not considered a part of blue carbon. However, recent discoveries have changed this perception. Advanced techniques like environmental DNA have detected microalgae in deep sea sediments, and it has been observed that microalgae bed can bury algae fragments. So in 2018, microalgae were recognized as type 4 coastal blue carbon. Despite this development, the methods and the standards for quantifying the carbon sequestration of microalgae are still not established, so making it difficult to quantify their climate impacts. As the world's leading country in algae cultivation by scale and yield, it's crucial for China to refine this methodology and advocate for inclusion of cultivated algae in the IPCC. They mainly sequester carbon through sedimentation and microbial processes, storing stable forms of particulate and dissolved organic carbon. Microalgae can store about 152 million stores of carbon worldwide annually. Taking example of Gratilaria in China, achieving carbon neutrality will require 125.2 million hectares of marine areas. Biomass carbon is added, it will require 45.4 million hectares. However, China's marine territory is 300 million hectares. The potential for algae-based carbon sequestration is substantial. The habit of intertidal algae is variable, influenced by tidal movements. Different tidal position expose algae to varying conditions, thereby affecting their carbon sequestration capabilities. Understanding how different species of algae, of microalgae respond to tidal position is crucial for accurate carbon accounting and future enhancement strategy. Our study used the Overprotusa as a model organism to address several issues. First, the impact of the desiccation and immersion circles caused by tidal on the release of dissolved organic carbon. Second, the internal sources of DOC within the algae. Next is the capacity for different tidal position to form refractory DOC. Finally, the relationship between carbon sequestration capabilities and the tidal position. Our initial step involved the field measurements, where we determined the effects of varying tidal position on light exposure, temperature, and the desiccation levels in Overprotusa. This was followed by controlled laboratory experiments to simulate the impact of this desiccation and immersion circles on DOC released. We observed that the sample at metatide levels, which experienced dehydration of 40%, exhibited the highest rate and volume of DOC released. Further, our work clarified the amount of DOC released during desiccation and immersion. During the desiccation process, around 2% of DOC were released onto sample surface, and this percentage increased as the extent of desiccation increased. We found that the rate of DOC release showed variability rather than steady decline, suggesting a regulatory mechanism within the algae to manage carbon release. Isotope labeling studies revealed that majority of the released DOC were carbon fixed earlier by algae. However, at 40% desiccation levels, the portion of DOC comes from newly fixed carbon, indicating enhanced cellular regulation and metabolic activity and stress. For the analysis of carbon and nitrogen ratio post desiccation indicated that while photosynthesis was inhibited, the carbon cycle persists, making photosynthetic activity a source of DOC during desiccation. DOC released at 40% dehydration degraded more rapidly, which could be related to the molecular size of the DOC. 3-dimensional fluorescence analysis of degraded DOC showed that the potential forming refractory DOC was highest in samples that were not dehydration. In contrast, a sample with 80% dehydration showed the highest degradation rates, with notable prevalence of R-stage bacteria, which are fast growing and utilize less stable carbon sources. Subsequent outdoor simulation and varying tidal condition cultivated similar result, affirming that overproducer at middle tide position had the most potent DOC release capabilities. In conclusion, our research highlighted the strongest DOC release capability in mid-tide microalgae, a direct correlation between the accumulation of DOC on microalgae surface and exposure duration during desiccation. The highest potential for forming refractory DOC at low tide position, indicating robust carbon sequestration abilities. This concludes my presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. For the English. So any questions from the audience? Professor Santos, Professor Price, you have any questions for our Chinese student? 大家有什么问题吗？有问题我们可以中文打字在我们的留言箱里，我们可以翻译成英文。Thank you, Dan. Thank you for encouragement. So, Lu Yao, have you measured RDOC carefully? RDOC. DOC, you have measured DOC, right? Carefully. So RDOC 的惰性
we just 就是我们只是测量了 RDOC 的结构，但是就是 DOC 的结构，它只是有一个 RDOC 的一个占比量，但是这个 RDOC 也只是说小。
Do you have any good method to measure RDOC?
If we can make sure what's the structure of RDOC, I think we can.
So my suggestion is you make some innovations in checking the RDOC carefully, released by seaweed. So how much percentage of the RDOC in the total DOC you have a structure? Do you have a structure?
Yeah, we have the related the 就是有一个通过一个算法吧，就是通过那个有一个
How many percentage you estimate how much RDOC?
因为它只能说是相对来说比较难降解的，但是它具体的是不是这个就是它具体是一个什么物质，或者是是怎么样的，还不能确定。
So it's important to measure it, to make it true, reliable, or to make it repeatable data for us. 就是这一块能测量得到吗？还是光能推测出来啊？
就是它只是看它那个物质的一个性质，能给它进行一个分类， 然后这些分类的这些物质，它是一个相对难降解的物质，或者是比较容易降解的物质，这个占比是可以得到的。
大概是多少？
嗯，这个我这里有一张图可以分享给大家。
Yeah，就是它是真实存在的，它大概有多少？
是
那真实存在的话，
这个图
它大
是我做的。
概能存在多少年？
能存在多少年不确定，我们只降解了几个月的时间。
那你降解出里边的 RDOC 占 DOC 里边多少啊？相对的，就 DOC 里边有多少相对来讲难降解呢？这尺度刚才那个谁讲有100年尺度也行。
about 差不多
多少
20%左右。
Okay, thank you. So, thank you for your wonderful talk, and congratulations for your research progress. Thank you.
老师您好，我想问一个问题
好的，小李。
啊，我想问一下那个 Santos 教授，我能直接问他吗？
Okay, you speak English.
Yes. Professor Santos, I'm Hui. I come from Ocean University of China, and thank you for your presentation. I think it's really nice. And I have two questions to ask about you. And the first is, what's your opinion of the role of shellfish aquaculture in the carbon sequestration? Because this actually is a very controversial question internationally. In China, most of us or aquaculture experts think that the shellfish aquaculture is a carbon sink because the shellfish can use the carbon dioxide into shell and then it's kind of carbon sequestration. But actually, recently, one review published in the reviews in aquaculture said that it's not a carbon sequestration because during the shellfish formation, the shellfish actually release one molecular carbon dioxide. So this is the first question I want to ask. And the second question is actually recently I do experiment about the co-cultivation between the shellfish and also the seaweeds. I have to say that I'm really new to the seaweeds blue carbon. So I want to ask you, do you have any questions about my new experiment, like the co-cultivation of shellfish and seaweeds? Because my main research interest is the seaweeds. So I want to focus on the seaweeds, but also want to combine like the IMTA, something like that. So this is my two questions. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, thanks. They are really complex questions. So let me start with the shellfish. And I think that's one of the topics that creates more confusion. There is lots of confusion about whether shells or coral reefs or any marine creatures that make calcium carbonate skeletons. So they do use carbon to make those skeletons, but they're not using CO2. They're using alkalinity or bicarbonate or carbonate. So during that process of taking the alkalinity out of the seawater, they do release CO2. So the growth of shells is a source of CO2, even if that's a sink of DIC. And that's a little counterintuitive. One of the alternatives to use shells for carbon sequestration would be to actually grind the shells, break them down into small fragments, and return them to the ocean. Now the shells are going to dissolve in seawater, and during the dissolution of those shells, they're going to release alkalinity and consume CO2. So it's counterintuitive. The second comment about the seaweeds, I'm not sure if I can follow on that, but you know, I'm in Qingdao right now. I'm visiting the Ocean University, and I'm visiting Bo Chao-Shu's research group. Really happy to have a chat in the next week or so. So I'll be at the university tomorrow morning if I can wake up.
Oh,
Okay.
really? I'm in Yushan campus. I'm the fishery college. So, but I'm really looking forward to seeing you and the further cooperation. So if
yeah, pop in, let's have lunch one of those days, and we can chat more about that.
Oh yeah, then I will send emails to you maybe tomorrow, and then we can check the time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Huirui. So yeah, that's great. You can meet tomorrow to discuss detail. So it's a very interesting question for the carbon calculation for the share and also for the muscle. So you will have a good talk discussion. So thank you, Huirui, and thanks, Professor Santos. And Lu Yao also, you may answer the question of Dr. Jiang Wenqing. Maybe better in English or in Chinese. 路遥回答一下吧。
Okay. We suggested that maybe the carbon fiction capacity is relatively strong when the desiccation levels is small, because the ability to obtain the carbon is strong. But if the seaweed in the air, the photosynthesis is restricted, and the fixed carbon is consumed to resist the adversity. So the carbohydrates are consumed greatly from the big one to some little, and pushed on the macroalgae surface.
OK， 所以姜老师OK, you are in Yantai. You may have a discussion with Lu Yao face to face. So it's a wonderful evening, lasted for more than 2 hours. And also we have attracted at most 200 people online. So before I close this online symposium, I would like to thank you very much, Professor Santos, Professor Fries. Also, to young speakers, Dr. Nair and Miss Lu Yao. So we are very, very happy to see a young generation growth. And also we would like to thank our host organizer, International Marine Biotechnology Association, IMBA. And also we thanks the big global project once ocean negative carbon emissions. And also the second International Coast Biology Congress will be happening in Hainan Island next month in Haikou. So I think Dr. Wang Yu will give you more detailed information. Welcome you Hainan Island, not only online meeting. This is a on-situ meeting. I would like to thank you, all of you, for your wonderful talks and very fruitful discussions. For example, the mangrove carbon sink, and also how we do the business to benefit more people. How we move to real blue carbon mechanism regarding ecosystem, not only the soil organic carbon. How we make detailed RDOC calculation, and we raise the importance of the fourth carbon, that's seaweed, natural seaweed populations, and as well as artificial cultivated seaweed as the fourth carbon, blue carbon, and even for the shellfish. Can we raise the shellfish carbon as the fifth blue carbon? So a long way for a big challenge. Anyway, let's work together to make this big issue to benefit the humanity and the marine ecosystem for sustainable Earth. So let's close this online meeting and see you next time in Hainan. Bye bye.